I'm Chantal de Jonge Oudraat, and I'm President of Women in International Security. I'm also one of the co-founders of the US Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. This is a group that was established some 7 years ago to encourage the US government to adopt a national action plan on women, peace and security. And since that plan was adopted by the US government, we continue to monitor the implementation of the US National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, and also provide advice to the US government on how to further this agenda. Well, I think what is really important to note is that terrorism and violent extremism is a global problem, is a global concern. And what we see is that a lot of women's organizations are stepping up and mobilizing to deal with this threat within their communities. I think the problem is that oftentimes their voices are not being heard at the national level or at an international level. And so the trick is, how do we get their voices being heard by national policymakers, by international policymakers? And that brings me then back to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which ultimately is about the participation of women in all decision-making processes when we're dealing with international peace and security issues. It's really about participation, and it is about the empowerment of women to speak up, give them voice when we're dealing with international peace and security issues, have them be at the table, have them run for national office. That's very important. A lot of these women's organizations are very active in their communities, but they're not active at the national political level. And I think that's where we need to do more work. Ultimately, this is all about gender equality. Currently, there is no one country that has achieved gender equality. And so there's a lot of work to do, both in our own country, the United States, as well as in other countries in the world. Well, I think one of the important messages that they have is that if we want to address the issue of violent extremism and terrorism, we have to look at the whole picture. We have to approach this in a holistic manner. We have to look not just at education, economic opportunities, but also at good governance. And the other issue that a lot of the women's organizations are emphasizing is that in many cases, actually the state is part of the problem. And in particular, the security apparatus, the security forces. Oftentimes the police or the military that are engaged in counterterrorism activities are not, or are part of the problem and are not respecting spaces, rights, basic human rights of people in communities. And I think that's part of the problem. It's very interesting. What we see is actually a growing number of young women joining these violent extremist forces. And in part, they're joining it because they feel that as a sense of empowerment. A lot of these extremist groups, be it jihadist groups or extreme right groups, will say and have this message that, come and join us, we will empower you. And these groups have been very successful in manipulating gender norms and gender stereotypes to further their own mission. And I think that is very worrisome, because on the other side, we have not realized the gender dimension of when we're dealing with violent extremism or terrorism. we think this is a sort of general problem, that is basically only young men that are involved. We're forgetting about the young women that are joining these groups. And this is on both sides of the ledger. So a lot of women join these groups. When they come back, they actually get lighter sentences. We don't think of them in similar serious terms. And so I think we need to do way more in terms of thinking through the gender specificities. Why do men and women join these groups? Are the motivations different, or are the manifestations different? And then also when they return or want to return to their country of origin, do we have the right reintegration and rehabilitation programs in place? So it's absolutely necessary for us to have also a gendered approach to reintegration and rehabilitation programs. Having a gendered approach to these issues is very important, and this approach is currently lacking. So UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted some 17 years ago. Remains a very, very important centerpiece of what we call the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and is basically about the participation of women in decision-making when it comes to international peace and security. It is also in part about the protection issues, but the most important thing of Resolution 1325 is to recognize that it is vital for our national security to have everybody involved, including women.